Now we don't have much time, so I'm going to talk fast because there's so much that I want you to know about me. I'm Alice Ann Bailey, and I think it's really important for you students at Southwestern College to have a sense of who I am. But more importantly, I want you to understand that I have a sense of who the Masters of Wisdom are, because you're students of consciousness. So you should have a sense of who these people are, because they are fostering the plan for the universe to raise consciousness. So I first encountered the Master when I was 15 years old. I was a petulant, spoiled, bratty little child. And I hated everyone. I hated the whole world. I don't think anybody really liked me either. I mean, I was just in a state. And I was really contemplating the meaning of life at this point, and whether or not I should exist anymore. That's where I was at. It was a very dark place. I had a few times in life that were relatively dark. But this one afternoon, it was a Sunday afternoon, and of all things I wasn't in church, because I was raised quite Christian, and I was an evangelist at one point in my life. So why I was home on a Sunday afternoon, I'm not sure. I should have been at church, but for whatever reason, I was home alone. I was reading in the drawing room, and in through the doors walks this man in a turban, and I was petrified. I mean, you can get a sense of how verbose I am. I was speechless the entire time this man was in the room with me, and he was saying to me things like, you know, Alice, there's great work for you to be doing here on the planet, but it does involve you changing your disposition quite considerably. You need to get a handle on this. And he went on to say that if I was able to do this, if I could change my disposition, it would prove to the Masters of Wisdom that I actually could be trusted. And if I could do this, and it was all up to me whether I could do this or not, if I could do it, there was great work for me to be doing in this world, and it involved me traveling all over the earth. Well, I didn't tell anybody about this meeting with this man because I was quite sure they would label me insane, and I wasn't ready for that at 15. But I did work very hard to change my demeanor, and was relatively successful at it, I think. So anyway, I grew up in Manchester, England. I was born into a very wealthy family in England, and my father was an engineer, and he had a project he was working on in Manchester. So we lived there until my parents died when I was 9 years old. Both of them passed away. And but up until the age of 22, I never wanted for anything. Money was no object. I was surrounded by interesting, talented, inspired, intellectual people my whole life. And I could travel anywhere in the world I wanted to go. I mean, life was easy. It was really quite wonderful. But from 22 on, I lived my life in dire poverty. It was quite a shift in realities. So at 22, I took a position as an evangelist in the British Army, and I moved to Belfast, Ireland. And I worked as an evangelist in this home there were probably 200 men in this home, and me. And so you can imagine what that is like for a woman in those days, to be living with all these men. And I was really quite shy. I mean, I've changed quite a bit, but I was really quite shy as a child. And at 22, I had to go in front of all these men and give a sermon. And you can imagine how that went. It was really quite horrible. I became quite terrified on stage, and I ran off. And I said, I'm never doing this again. I'm not getting up on a stage again, on a pulpit or anything. And but I was living my life at that time, and I've actually lived my life all my life with this creed in mind. What would Jesus do in this situation? So within 2 weeks, I found myself back up on the pulpit giving sermons, and I really thought I got quite good at it. And eventually, there was a sister home connected to this home in Belfast, and they were located in India. And the director of that home for soldiers, she became quite ill, and she had to return to Ireland. And so they decided to send me in her place, but there were no funds for the trip down there. And in my really arrogant Christian demeanor, I said, if God wants me to go, God will provide the funds. Well, within 3 days, there was a cashier's check that had arrived in the amount of £500, and at the bottom was inscribed, for the work in India. So that's how I went to India for the first time. And this was in the early 1900s, and I traveled to India on a boat by myself to a foreign land, and I will say it was a very courageous act for me to do that. But what I found throughout my entire life that has really been humbling is that humanity has always been there for me. Whether I really felt I deserved it or not, people always came and took care of me. And on that journey, there was a man who looked after me for not just that trip, but he looked after me for the time I was in India. So in this time in India, I was contacted by my master the second time. And this time, he didn't come as a human, as a person. He came as a bright beam of light that came into my bedroom. And then I heard his voice in my head, and what he said to me was, "Alice, things are going quite well, going according to plan, we're very happy with the work you're doing, but things are about to change, and you're going to have to work extremely hard, and I want you to keep one thing in mind. Circumstances can be deceiving." And on that note, he left, and I became quite ill relatively soon after that conversation. It was really due to a lack of rest. I was quite a workaholic, really. I mean, I existed on about 4 hours of sleep most of my life. So anyway, at this time, I became quite exhausted, but I was also going through a very inner process at that time where I was really starting to question everything about the Christian faith. The only thing that I never questioned was my belief in the Christ. But everything else was up for grabs, and it brought a deep sorrow for me. So I went back to England, and for about the next 2 years I was back and forth between India and England. But what was going on in that time was that a marriage was being arranged for me. I was to marry Walter Evans, who was a middle-class Brit, which you can imagine if that presents something of a quandary for a woman like me. And so we were married in 1908, and we left for the United States. And Walter was moving to the United States to be trained as a minister. So we went to the United States, and I will say, these are very hard years for me to talk about. This was a very horrendous time in my life. I was married to a man who was physically very, very violent and abusive to me. And that was a time of real darkness for me. Just, not only that, not only the horrendousness of being beaten, but also, for the first time in my life, I was obligated to run a household, which I had never done. And so I had to do all the cooking and the cleaning, and these were things that I was completely unfamiliar with. So once again, neighbors helped out, and the community at large really helped me through this dark time. And the church eventually became aware of the abuse that I was suffering. And they said to Walter, "You're going to Montana, and you're going to pay alimony every month to Alice." So he went off, and the alimony checks really never came, nor did the money that I had in my trust fund back in England. So poverty was my friend during those years. And I moved into this shack in Pacific Grove, California, which is where we had been living, and I acquired 200 chickens, and I sold those eggs, or rather I traded the eggs to the general store in an effort to pay off the debt that my husband had accumulated. It was quite a large sum, but I felt the obligation to take care of that debt. And even during this time, I took work in a cannery. I was packing sardines. You can imagine, an upper-class British woman working in a factory. But I was actually quite good at it. I was very efficient. And in this time, this was about a 7-year span in my life of just hard times. No stimulating conversation, you know, just survival. I was in survival mode. Well, I got wind that there were 2 Brit women living in Pacific Grove, and I just said, I am going to force myself on these women. I need some intellectual stimulation. I'm going to find these women. So I sought them out. And these 2 women, fascinatingly enough, students of H.P. Blavatsky. And they introduced me to her book, The Secret Doctrine. And I will say that those were some of the most valuable and enjoyable hours of my life, reading that book. Very fascinating. Well, anyway, I became consumed with theosophy, which was her philosophy that they were following. And I actually started teaching classes in consciousness, which I knew nothing about. I mean, who was I to teach this class? But the way I did it was I stayed 6 pages ahead in the reading, and the class went on. And so I became quite good at leading these groups, and I eventually ended up meeting my second husband, Foster Bailey. I actually did go through a divorce process, which was granted immediately when they heard my case. They said, yes, you can have divorce, which was quite rare in those days. But I met Foster, and within that same year, I met my second master of wisdom, who was, you might have heard of him. He's sometimes referred to as the Tibetan. His name's Jawal Kul, which I think is a very great name. And anyway, he came to me. One afternoon, I was taking a rest in the field behind my home, and I heard this single note of very beautiful music, and it moved from the sky down into the hill below me and back up into my body. And then he began to speak to me, and he said, Alice, there's some work that we think you'd be quite good at, and it involves you transcribing some, writing some books for me. I'm going to give you the information, I need you to write these books. And I said, I'll have no part in that. No, I'm not going to do this. This is the work of psychics. I'm not going to move into that realm. I have 3 children I have to look after, and psychics tend to go mad. So I'm not going to do that to my children. I won't take on this obligation. And he said, Alice, a wise person doesn't make a decision immediately. They give it time. So I'll be back in 3 weeks. And he did promptly return in 3 weeks. And I hadn't even given it a single thought in those 3 weeks. Never even crossed my mind. I was a very busy woman back then. I didn't have time to think about these things. So he shows back up, and he says, I would really like you to do this work for me. And I once again said, no, I'm not interested. Thank you very much. And, and he said, Alice, I beg of you, really, just give this a couple weeks, experiment with it, see what you think. I said, okay, I can do that. I can work with you for a few weeks, we'll give it a try. And in those few weeks, he transferred the information for the book Initiation, Human and Solar, which was the first book in a series of 30 books that we did together. So, not 30, I'm sorry, 30 years of work together, 24 books. So it was quite a time together. I just want to let you know that those books inspired an enormous response around the world, and people wrote to me quite prolifically. There was one year where I wrote 10,000 responses.
Wow.
It took me 48 minutes just to open all the letters one day. Not even to pull them out, just to slice the envelope. So you can imagine how busy I was. And during this time, I also started to become disenfranchised with the Theosophical Society, because it was an institution based in consciousness, but it was run in such a reactionary manner that I decided to pull away. And Foster and I moved to New York, and we started the Arcane School, which is still available to all of you today. It takes about 13 years to complete. The tuition is free, it's based on donation, what you can afford to bring to it. And I'd really like, there's 3 more things I want to say to you, I think are very important. One is the Quimby Library has so many of our books, and I really encourage all of you to take a peruse through there. And I'm sure you can somehow talk Leslie into loaning you them. The other thing I want to say is that I was great friends with Roberto Assagioli. And I know that you're all familiar with him. He's a lovely man. And I want you to know that he too was in contact with the Tibetan. And H.P. Blavatsky was in contact with the Masters of Wisdom as well. And the whole premise of transpersonal psychology and psychosynthesis was part of a dialogue between the Tibetan and Assagioli. I think that's fascinating. And the one last piece I'm going to leave you with, something to ponder, is Carl Jung had some thoughts on me. And what his thoughts were was that the Tibetan was the higher personification of Alice Bailey, and that Alice Bailey was the lower personification of Alice Bailey. But what I'd like to say to Jung, if I ever get a chance to meet him, is how was it ever possible to receive packages from India from the Tibetan if he was a personification of myself? And that's an important piece, is the Tibetan was a human being. He is a master of wisdom, but they were all in the human form. So I leave you all on that note. I've had so much fun being here today.